Welcome to Reformation 2017, Re-Fermenting the Church, Ron Talk Part 2C. My name is Ron Rood. In Part 1, after exploring medievalism's version of Roman Catholic theology, what Martin Luther and the Reformers did to try to change it, and several important Lutheran nuances, and in Part 2, exploring significant worldview-changing paradigm shifts that have happened since 1517 in various arenas, including important social and political and economic transformations, changes in technology and scientism. In this Part 2C, we will explore significant developments in biblical scholarship and research that have happened since Luther's time. Much, of course, has happened since the 1500s. What we know and do not know about the biblical world, and what scholars know and do not know about the Bible itself, is on a different scale compared to medieval times. For example, several generations of pastors and educators have now been schooled in the Wallhausen synthesis, which identifies at least 3 or 4 main sources from which the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch, were pieced together over a period of hundreds of years. This means that Moses did not write everything in these books, including the story about his death and burial, though this is what the biblical text says. Various disciplines too have emerged during these 5 centuries, including studies in such things as historical context, form criticism, redaction research, textual analysis, canon development, and various source theories. There are narrative analyses and feminist perspectives, and fascinating new insights that come from reading Scripture through third world eyes and other cultures, through lesbian and gay and transgender perspectives, through scientific eyes, through the eyes of various philosophical schools of thought, and even through the eyes of agnostic and atheist researchers. Much has changed too in our ability to date manuscripts, making this a fascinating scholarly enterprise in itself. For example, even though the Gospel of Matthew is presented first in the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark is more likely the first book to have been written, probably about 10 to 15 years earlier than Matthew and Luke. And even though Paul's letters were positioned after the Gospels in the New Testament, Paul's letters were actually written before the Gospels, showing perhaps an earlier theology and an earlier form of Christian practice. Notice that some New Testament letters that claim authorship by St. Paul were probably written decades after his death, by his followers perhaps, explaining their sometimes divergent views from authentic Pauline literature. We have to remember that prior to Martin Luther, the church pretty much controlled the Bible, and they controlled its interpretation. But Luther, we might say, opened a can of worms, saying now that everyone should study the Scriptures. And now everyone does. These are just some of the dedicated scholars who have undertaken important work for their whole life in many cases in biblical research. I refer you especially to Walter Brueggemann's monumental book, Theology of the Old Testament, especially the first 104 pages where he brilliantly traces the history of biblical research and scholarship since the time of Martin Luther. Then, of course, there is biblical archaeology, which sometimes confirms the biblical narrative and sometimes contradicts it. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 11 Qumran caves in Palestine between 1947 and 1956. There are newly discovered historical records and writings from outside the Bible, some of which corroborate the biblical narrative, others which conflict. Which is more accurate? Of course, we have no original writings when it comes to the Bible. What we do have are numerous copies of copies of copies of copies. And these vary. Verb tenses vary. Words and phrases and even old passages are sometimes left out, or added, or changed. In the earliest New Testament Greek manuscripts, all the letters are in capitals, with no space between words, and almost no punctuation. Imagine reading a book in English where there were no periods, no commas, no question marks or quotation marks, where there was no spacing between words, let alone trying to read these in an ancient and strange language. So there is profound and careful scholarship going on to determine which manuscripts are more authentic, older, or closer to the originals, what they say, what they mean, how they were changed. This is a real scholarly endeavor. But the challenges go even further. What do we do when biblical accounts conflict with historical documents from outside the Bible? Or when scientific knowledge differs starkly from biblical worldviews and bodies of knowledge in both Bible times and Protestant Reformation times? What happens when we find certain theologies in the Bible to be incomplete or false or even destructive? What happens, given what we know today, when a Christian flat out disagrees with something quite foundational in the biblical narrative? For example, the claim that the God of the Old Testament, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, wants the Jewish community to own current Palestine and Israel and Jordan and Lebanon and most of Syria, irrespective of the farms and businesses and cultural markers and languages and households that have resided there for centuries and centuries. But the biggest change for me is the realization that there are really two scriptures, and both are of equal importance. There's God's voice and God's actions and story and narrative speaking through nature, through atoms and stardust, geological layers and rock formations, plant and animal fossils, biological and chemical markers, DNA, tree rings, and layers of ice cap history, and through the fossils of Homo sapiens and our predecessor species, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus. God has been writing these scriptures for at least 13.7 billion years, and they are still being written today. This voice, shall we say, of God, embedded in simple and in complex ecosystems and patterns, is addressed to all and read by all of God's ecosystems and species in this universe in their own language. So salamanders read these scriptures. White-tailed deer do too, as do bristlecone pine trees and various forms of bacteria and algae and even viruses, each in the language God has given them. Humans, including Christians too, need to read and study these scriptures, I believe. In fact, I would argue that we have an incomplete and inadequate understanding of God's story of life and God's story of Jesus if we do not study these. They address God's full-time job. We might call it God's primary mission. That is the unfolding story of life. And then, of course, there is God's most recent scriptures, what we call the Bible. They're only about 3,000 years old, and part of some very modern religions called Judaism and Christianity. These scriptures, unlike the other ones, are addressed to and read by only one species, Homo sapiens, that's us. Not because we are any more special than all the ecosystems and species of God's creation, or any more necessary, but because we are the one species that has, you might say, gone nuts and is at war with God's ways, truths, and life. So God has taken on a secondary mission, you might say, to try and heal our species and bring us back into the fold. This is what the Bible is about, that story. And I'll be exploring this idea further in part 3 of these Ron Talks. In part 2, we've been identifying significant paradigm shifts that have taken place during the 500 years since the Protestant Reformation. Shifts that have changed our worldviews and may be even transforming Christian theology itself. Changes in social and political and economic realities, in technology and scientism, and in biblical scholarship, including the recognition of a form of God's voice and action that we have too often perhaps overlooked. Both are needed. In part 3, I will be exploring a way forward for the next leg of the Reformation journey, a new brew, so to speak, a re-fermenting that I suggest goes deeper and perhaps larger into God's story of life and God's story of Jesus.